Okay, so we've spent first half of this lecture talking about some of the inequality that is present, how much of that is biologically based, hint very little, and how much of that is culturally reinforced. We've talked about this notion of the patriarchy and how masculinity and cultural and the connotations of masculinity can be really detrimental both to males and females. Before we move on to alternate gender expression, I just want to inspire you to think just a little bit more about how strongly gendered our own society is. So, one of the um, problems and one of the um, kind of factors that makes it crucial to recognize alternate gender expression is the degree to which society is gendered. And so we, in the 1970s and 1980s, were moving somewhat away from some of these strong cultural notions of what it meant to be masculine or feminine. But if anything, we've moved back to the point where we're even more strongly gendered than we were in the 70s and 80s. And so, what do we mean by this? Well, first of all, how many of you have gone to a baby shower? Okay. Maybe it's because you've had your own children. Maybe it's because you've got friends or family members that have had their own children. We start gendering infants from really the moment they're born, in the sense of you can't buy female baby clothing. Well, you can, but it's expensive and you've got to know where to look. That has something on it other than kitty cats, fairies, flowers, etc. Right? Princess, that's another one. There's an interesting book that came out several years ago called Disney Ate My Daughter, talking about princess culture, right? Similarly, we can't buy clothes for boy babies that don't have dinosaurs or dump trucks or fierce animals like tigers, or sports imagery. Right? So, from the moment our babies are born, we're heavily gendering them. The same thing is true among toys, right? Um, where are your gender neutral toys? First of all, what is a gender neutral toy? Right? A gender neutral toy is one that does not, so to raise a child gender neutral does not mean that you give boy babies girl toys and girl babies boy toys. Okay, it means that you're focusing on toys that foster like intellectual development and kind of higher cognition, spatial awareness, etc. So that would be blocks. That would be musical instruments. That would be balls. Like all of those things are essentially gender neutral toys. But we go and gender even our gender neutral toys. So you want to buy a ball for a girl? Well, it's probably going to have fairies or princesses all over it. You want to buy a ball for a boy? It's going to have like flames or something like that on it. Blocks for girls and blocks for boys. I remember Lego had a great ad in the 1980s that talked about how Legos were for everybody, and it didn't show Lego friends, right? Instead, it just showed those primary color Legos and girls and boys playing with them. I mean, Lego are gender neutral, but we branded everything now. So now you no longer buy just your run of the mill solid color Legos. Instead, you buy your Lego sets. And those sets are either masculine with like superheroes and dinosaurs or feminine with like girlfriends and puppies and ice cream parlors and such. And so, it's like they've sold us out. Society has sold us out. We don't have option. I mean, you do have options, but it's really hard to exercise those options because places like Walmart, places like Target, right? Their aisles are designated as girl toys and boy toys. So to really seek out like some of the good Montessori toys, etc., I mean, you've got to pay an arm and a leg, or you've got to like know where to find those things. So it shouldn't surprise us that we see even more gender inequality now than we did 30 years ago, because we are highly gendering our society. When my daughter, she's 17 now, when she was an infant, Old Navy came out with a onesie for babies, like little babies, a girl's onesie that said hot to trot, and another one that said eye candy. that's sexualizing infants, guys. That's pretty disturbing, right? So really, it's hard to escape cultural notions of what it means to fill gender roles, and we are kind of narrowing the boxes into which people fit, instead of allowing for males to express any suite of behaviors that they want to express, including styles of dress, ways of using language, hobbies, pastimes, etc. Then we're still forcing a box as we encourage them to identify as perhaps transgender, right? We're not saying, hey, anybody can be anything, anybody can wear whatever clothes they want to wear, etc. Right? We are reinforcing the dichotomy um, by expecting um, natal males, trans females, to fill incredibly feminine roles, and by expecting native females, trans males, to fill incredibly masculine roles. So, this is just something to put in the back of your head. We do better by abolishing gender, right? We would do better if we recognize everyone's value as a person, and that none of the suite of characteristics and behaviors that you express are wrong for you as an individual. So, anyway, all right, so what does it mean to be neither male nor female? In some societies, individuals live their lives as neither male nor female without social stigma, and in some cases, it's even prestigious. This is coupled with such variation as sex preferences. So this notion of heterosexuality versus homosexuality versus bisexuality. And so we get some really complex gender variants intersecting with sexual preference. In other words, gender variation doesn't necessarily imply variation in sexuality. You can have variation in sexuality with rigid gender roles. You can have differential gender expression within really rigid rules about sexuality. So we're going to look at a few cultures that allow for and even celebrate alternative gender identity. We're going to start with the Navajo. The Nodlahe, and I know I'm mispronouncing that and I apologize, individuals combine male and female roles and characteristics and are highly respected. They participate in religious ceremonies, they act as spiritual healers, and they act as go betweens in arranging marriages and mediating conflicts. And so, according to the Navajo, and we've got similar sorts of practices among the Zuni, among different Puebloan Native Americans, you've got four genders. Um, you've got female and male, and then you've got manly female, and you've got uh, feminine male. Um, Many young Navajo are now being labeled gay or lesbian, adopting Western forms of identification in place of these traditional Navajo genders. So we're seeing them conform more to American definitions instead of perhaps embracing that alternate expression and the ceremonial role that holds for their particular culture. Um, in India, there is a third gender known as Hijra. These are biological males who are often sexually impotent, either because they were born intersex or because they were castrated. The Hijra have a ceremonial role. They provide blessings when a boy is born, or they also bless a couple's fertility at weddings. And this is something that since British colonialism, there have been attempts to formally outlaw hijras. This Indian gender sex system still considers hijras, this combination of male and female, as valid and meaningful. In Mexico, we have the muhe, and this is particularly Zapotec society. These are males who dress and behave in ways that are otherwise associated with women. They are often seen as a third gender. Some marry women and have children. Some marry men or have men as both sexual and or romantic partners. Lynn Stephen, who studied the Muhe, said that the Muhe may do certain kinds of women's work, such as embroidery or decorating home altars, but that some Muhe do male work, like making jewelry. And the Muhe are subdivided into the terms vestidas, or those who are dressed, i.e., they wear female clothing, and pintadas, or those who wear male female clothes and makeup. They've been traditionally seen as good luck. So we've got old world examples, we've got new world examples of alternate gender ideology. There are so many of them. There are the Fa'afine in Oceania, like Samoa. There is an island in Dominica where there are a large number of boys that are born with a 5 alpha reductase deficiency. And what this means is that they look, for all intents and purposes, they look female when they're born. Their testes don't descend and their penis is not elaborated. And so they're raised as girls, but in this one village, about 40% of girls then transition with a rite of passage at puberty where they become men. And this is because this particular population has been pretty reproductively isolated. And so for these children with 5 alpha reductase deficiency, when they hit puberty, their testes descend and their penis grows, and they end up then developing male secondary sexual characteristics. So in some cases, we've got a genetic anomaly that results in being raised as a girl until you hit puberty and then going through a rite of passage and becoming a man. So the variety that we see cross culturally, most cultures are not put off by children who have alternate gender expression. And in fact, many have roles and formal recognition of that alternate gender expression. In the United States, we've got the term transgender. This is a general term that describes transsexuals, transvestites, drag queens, drag kings, and intersex individuals. Many of the people who occupy this category don't necessarily identify themselves as transgender. We've got the relatively new designation of non-binary, right? Or being gender fluid. And the one thing I challenge you with as you examine the US and our treatment of individuals with alternate gender expression is that in many cases we're still trying to fit them into that distinctly male versus female box. And so rather than accepting that females can be masculine, rather than accepting that females can be interested in cars and dinosaurs and sports and such, and dress how they want to dress and talk how they want to talk, right? We identify that as being expression of alternate gender and encourage them to transition. So, I hold to the point that our society is too highly gendered, and we need to stop being so concerned with making people fit into definitions of male or female. All right, so thinking critically about gender and sex and sexuality, societies in which gender variance is common tend to also be societies that are tolerant towards ambiguity and complexity in other areas of life, such as religious beliefs. How and why might its society develop an acceptance of ambiguity and complexity? And then beyond gender and religious beliefs, in what other aspects of social life might one expect to see a tolerance for ambiguity? This could be career choice. This could be, you know, any of those behaviors that are seen as typically male or typically female, like military participation or, being a builder or construction worker, etc. Right? Ambiguity and complexity is more common in multicultural societies that particularly don't have this strong focus on the patriarchy. And one of the things that's true of the Puebloans, that's true of the Navajo, that's true of many of the Native American populations that have the two-spirit individuals or other named recognition of alternate gender ideology is that many of them are still matriarchies at their core. If you go and you tour any of the pueblos, which of course you can't do right now with COVID, but if you go and you tour the pueblos, they talk about how women hold the ownership of property, how women will make marriage decisions, how women are in positions of leadership. And so typically among cultures where we've got relative gender equality and women have a strong role, we're also more willing to tolerate ambiguity and complexity. All right, so we're going to segue straight into human sexuality. Is human sexuality just a matter of being straight or queer? Well, let's recognize that if it's imperfect to have a sharp dichotomy between masculine and feminine, male or female, then it's probably inaccurate to have a sharp dichotomy between straight and queer. And so, one value of anthropologists studying sexuality is that we're able to recognize and state that this human sexuality is not a straight queer dichotomy. Rather, your individual sexuality is flexible. It occurs along a continuum from asexuality, or not really having any sexual feelings, to polyamory and having love of many. Anthropologists reject the notion that sexuality is an essence that's buried deep in a person's psychological self or genetic makeup. So this sounds like anthropologists don't feel that you're born this way. Okay. Now, is that really what anthropologists would say? No. Anthropologists might say that there is an underlying tendency, but culture shapes people in a variety of different ways, so that we see a lot of flexibility expressed in sexuality that is context specific or culturally specific. So sexuality is learned, it's patterned, it's shaped by the cultural context in which one lives. So when we look at ethnographers who have developed these cross-cultural studies of sexuality, many of the ethnographers that have been drawn to these fields identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And a difficulty faced by anthropologists studying same-sex sexuality is, how do we name it as such? How do we adequately name what we are studying and recognize that it's highly personal? And that a lot of times people might not be entirely honest because of the ramifications if they are. So there's this notion of coming out as an ethnographer, as well as how safe it is to quote unquote come out in the population in which you're studying. Okay. In some cultures, same sex behaviors exist side by side with heterosexual behaviors. This suggests that our assumptions about sexuality are not universally applicable. So, Gilbert Hurt documented quote unquote ritualized homosexuality among the Sambia. He was criticized for using the term homosexuality because its emic purpose is more tied to symbolically developing masculine strength, i.e., Sambia men engage in sexual behavior that reinforces their social bonds and allows them to become more masculine so that they will be able to serve a male role in society. It's kind of like when we look at bonobos, right? I don't remember whether we've talked here about the differences between chimpanzees and bonobos, but I think we have a little bit with respect to violence. Common chimpanzees have um, a societal structure that is male centered. And as such, males are incredibly aggressive, and there's a lot of violence that goes on in common chimpanzee society. So when a male tries to come into a troop, well, he's going to be faced with a lot of outright aggression from other males. When females come into a troop, they're also similarly going to be exposed to a lot of aggression from other males. When there's a problem between troops, they engage in ritualized warfare. They will oftentimes decimate neighboring populations. So, common chimps are very aggressive, very warlike, very male centered. Among bonobos, they're female centered. And this is not associated with females staying in their natal troop. It seems like it would be, right? That we can be female centered when females are surrounded by kin. But interestingly, for bonobos, females still leave their natal troop when they hit puberty. And what they do instead is they engage in a practice known as GG rubbing, which is same sex sexual behavior. They rub their estrus swellings together to the point that they make vocalizations that lead primatologists to believe that they're actually reaching orgasm in their genital rubbings. And what this does is it diffuses a lot of the aggression. So when there's conflict, instead of having outright warfare and fighting, the bonobos will engage in widespread rampant sexual practice, both same sex and opposite sex. So they use sex to mitigate aggression. They use sex to form and foster social relationships that are really, really, really strong bonds. And so among the Samiya people, this male same-sex sexual behavior is similar to that. It's tied symbolically to developing unity and masculine strength. Some married Filipino women who work as domestic maids in Hong Kong have Hong Kong only affairs with other women. This has much more to do with context than innate sexuality, because these women don't self identify as lesbians. If you think about America with its prison population, heck, I mean, when you're housed in same-sex institutions, and the only way that you're going to get sex is with same-sex individuals, right? And so we've got male prisoners specifically who engage in male-male sexual behavior, but are adamant about the fact that they're heterosexual. It's just that their only option set in a same-sex prison are other males. In Latin American countries, passivity and activity are critical distinctions. So a man who penetrates another man would not be considered, either by himself or others, as homosexual. Yet the man being penetrated would be. So you can be, I mean, the idea that males perform an active role in sex instead of a passive role, and it is being passively penetrated that defines whether you're homosexual or not. So we're going to look at two tribes in a little bit more detail. We're going to look at the Azande, which we've already discussed because we had that video, Witchcraft Among the Azande. The Azande are in South Sudan. Their sexuality reflects isolation according to sex. And so they live with this reality of endemic warfare. And so it's very important for them to have groups who are the warriors of their tribe. So there's a stage of men's lives where they are sex segregated, kept away from females, and serve this function as warriors. And so prospective warriors are males aged 12 to 20. They leave their families and they share quarters with adult fighting men. The adult warriors will pay bride wealth for these men in the form of cattle. They will have sex with these men, with these prospective warriors. While these prospective warriors are apprenticed, they also do the domestic duties of women. Once they reach about 20, 21, and they pass through a rite of passage and become actual warriors, these young men will then pay bride wealth for and become spouses to younger male brides. Once they retire from warrior status in their early 30s, Azande men then marry women and have families. So we see a great degree of flexibility in their sexual expression. They have sex with older men as male brides, they have sex with younger men as warriors, and they have sex with women as husbands. And yet at no point in their life course would they define themselves as obligate, straight versus, or the sharp dichotomy of straight versus homosexual. In Papua New Guinea, we have the Atoro. There's a lot, again, just as with the Azande in South Sudan, there's a lot of endemic warfare among tribes in Papua New Guinea, and the Atoro are no exception. And so there's this strong belief about male virility and the need for males to be tightly bonded to one another. So there's extreme tension surrounding male-female sexual relations. The Atoro believe that semen gives life force to a fetus, and that fetus was implanted in women by an ancestral spirit. So you've got to have sexual intercourse with women during pregnancy in order to nurture a growing fetus. Once the woman is no longer pregnant, however, except to conceive other infants, it's generally frowned upon to have sex with women. Men believe that their supply of semen is limited. So every time that semen gets used up, it zaps some of their strength and male virility. So heterosexual intercourse is necessary, but only for reproduction. And having too much heterosexual sex will lead to men dying. Women who want too much sex are viewed as witches trying to kill their husbands. So societally, heterosexual sex is discouraged, and it's removed from the public areas of community life. You don't have men and women living together. They don't work together in production. Sex is only allowed in the woods, and in Papua New Guinea, in the highlands, there's a risk of encountering snakes and spiders that can kill you. So heterosexual sex is allowed only 100 days a year, but sex between males and other males is viewed as essential. boys who have reached about age 10 are inseminated orally by older men so they can grow into men and give that life force to their children. These homosexual acts take place in the village, like the sleeping area or the garden. They are governed by a code of propriety. They are allowed every day of the year. Sexual relationships between older and younger males are viewed as essential. Those between boys of the same age are discouraged, and these sex hungry boys who develop too quickly are also viewed as witches. So we've got this notion that we can have the social sanction of homosexual behavior in societies, particularly where there's high degree of warfare, and you've got this need for male warriors. At no point, as the Atoro or the Azande integrate into the greater nation state as a whole, would they just define themselves as homosexual. Okay? It's a stage of their life course that they go through where it's socially acceptable to have heterosexual sex. So when we think about in the United States, Europe, I mean, we are in a weird kind of situation where we expect people to engage in sexual practices at one end of the continuum or the other. We expect for people to have exclusive sexuality, whether that sexuality is exclusively homosexual or exclusively heterosexual. And we have very rigid kind of definitions as to what those identity means. So when we talk about things like homosexuality, we've got to recognize there's a lot of local variability, and that this can matter in more than just semanticity or academic concerns. So in Latin America, where we've got this notion of basically being the passive penetrated versus the active penetrator, HIV and AIDS education campaigns failed to account for the distinction that was noted above. So, you've got to have, for any kind of health education, you've got to have knowledge of what the underlying contextual kind of circumstances and how that particular culture defines terms associated with heterosexuality. So many of these early Latin American HIV and AIDS campaigns, many men didn't self-identify as homosexual, but were identified as homosexual by foreign medical agencies, thusly didn't take the necessary precautions to prevent the spread of HIV. This notion of sexuality and its role in identity. In the 1940s, there was a biologist, Alfred Kinsey, who conducted a series of really interesting studies that led to his conclusion that sexuality exists along a continuum. It was really controversial during this point in American history. Homosexuality and heterosexual promiscuity were both considered unacceptable, but he found that fully 36% of all males engage in at least one homosexual sex act at some point in their life, and that does not lead to self-identification as a homosexual. So, Americans, even at a time where it was less acceptable to engage in unmarried sex and same sex sexual practices, still a large proportion of Americans were engaging in what would have been considered at the time socially deviant expressions of sexuality. So today, anthropologists emphasize that human sexuality is highly flexible. They also are careful not to exaggerate its centrality in people's lives. I mean, sexuality is very, very strongly tied to various aspects of your identity. It's an incredibly personal topic to discuss, and it's particularly hard to recognize that people are allowed to change their identity. Our identity is not static, it's dynamic, and there can be times of our lives where we identify in one way and times of our lives where we identify in another. And nowhere is this more evident than in expressions of our sexuality. So I don't know, cut people some slack, right? And recognize the fluidity of a lot of aspects of human culture and human identity. Ellen Lewis writes that, like other people, lesbians and gay men, identify themselves along a number of axes, and sexual orientation is often a salient dimension of their identification. Other personal and social characteristics also feed into how they view themselves. So people's identity is flexible. Your identity is flexible. Your one time behavior um, it, it's not something that identifies you as complying with a certain identity for the rest of your life. You're allowed to, and there's certain times of your lives too, where you're expected to experiment, where you're expected to engage in behaviors that help to secure the identity uh, that you believe you have. Some of those times are during your teen years, right? Like cut our teens some slack, not just sexually, definitely cut our teens some slack with respect to sexuality. Premarital sex is not the root of all evil, right? But teens are supposed to make mistakes. Teens are supposed to try on a variety of identities without any of those necessarily sticking for the rest of their lives, right? We all did it when we were teens. Some of you still are teens. And I just sound like some old fogey parent telling you to go out and live your life. But you know, recognize that flexibility is characteristic of our human pattern of development and cut people slack, right? All right, so some of the more divisive political issues in the United States, like abortion, gays in the military, same sex marriage, even whether or not we should have state sanctioned sex education, which we should not solely leave it up to families and religions to teach sexuality, involve questions over whether and how the government should control the sexuality of its citizens. Some of these have huge ramifications. China had a one child policy after the 1950s. This reduced fertility rate and reduced unemployment, but it also created strict government control over sexuality, including draconian measures like forced abortion and sterilizations of women who exceeded their quota or were deemed unfit to reproduce. In the United States, we have had a historical um, propensity to sterilize people of color and to sterilize people who have either severe mental health issues or developmental disabilities. So, this is something we can say, oh, China was evil, they shouldn't do this, right? But we've done it in relatively recent times in the United States as well. So, to end with, as you think critically about gender, sex, and sexuality, many queer activists in the US and Europe have accepted and promote the idea that they were born with their sexual identity and that they have no choice in the matter. How do you think anthropologists who view sexuality as culturally patterned, socially conditioned, and not inborn should respond to this idea? That is, are you born a certain way? Or do you have the flexibility to pay attention to prevalent cultural messages, to pay attention to just who you happen to love and feel attracted to at a moment, and change your identity, right? Are we obligate heterosexuals or obligate homosexuals, where we're exclusive in our identity and in who we consider as available sexual partners? And is there a way, and this is going to kind of buck the trend of what's socially acceptable right now, but is there like some valid standing for anthropologists highlighting the role that culture plays in people's sexuality? In other words, should anthropologists um, make it known and educate people that sexuality, just like gender, just like race, etc., is culturally conditioned and incredibly flexible?